Millionaire makes virgin worker pregnant. He denies the child until he looks at the baby. Let's start the story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Write your name and city in the comments. The jagged edge of the broken monitor had opened a clean line across Patrick Kane's knuckles. He watched, detached, as 3 drops of blood landed on the silk threads of a rug that cost more than most people's cars. A $50 million deal, vaporized by a traitor in his ranks. It was a survivable wound, but an infuriating one. He was already calculating the ruin he would bring down on the man responsible when the sound of his office door opening pulled his attention. It was the one person who never entered without being summoned. Hilary Knight stood silhouetted against the storm-lashed Chicago skyline. Her usual flawless composure was fractured, not shattered, held together by a sheer, terrifying act of will. Rain and tears had conspired to draw black rivulets down her face, and she clutched a simple manila envelope to her chest like a shield. He'd known her for 2 years. She was the unflappable center of his corporate hurricane, the only person whose loyalty he never questioned. Now she looked at him with the eyes of a stranger, witnessing a terrible accident. "We need to talk." Her voice was a frayed whisper, yet it sliced through the howl of the wind outside. Patrick Kane, at 35, moved markets with a single word. His empire was built on the cold, hard logic of numbers and leverage. But as Hilary closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch echoed with the finality of a vault being sealed. The air grew heavy, intimate, and dangerous. All his power felt like currency from a foreign land, utterly worthless here. He rounded his desk, the crunch of glass under his Italian shoes the only sound. His instincts, honed in 1,000 boardrooms, were screaming. This wasn't a corporate problem. This was an extinction-level event. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. 3 months ago, she began, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. The night of the Henderson party. The memory ambushed him, not a vague recollection, but a sensory imprint. The scent of her hair, the surprising warmth of her hand in his, the way the city lights looked from his penthouse when the rest of the world had gone to sleep. For one night, the professional armor had dissolved, melted away by champagne and a shared moment of exhaustion that felt dangerously like peace. He had seen past the brilliant assistant, and she, he'd thought, had seen past the monster. It had been a mistake, a beautiful, reckless mistake he had locked away and refused to examine. Now she was bringing it into the light. She finally met his eyes, and the vulnerability there was a weapon aimed at his core. "I tried to pretend it didn't matter, that it was just a moment, but I can't. Some things, they have consequences." His mind, a ruthless catalogue of threats, raced through the possibilities. Blackmail? A lawsuit? He could feel the familiar ice forming in his veins, the coldness that had made him a billionaire. It was his shield, his sword. "What's in the envelope, Hilary?" The question was a blade. She didn't flinch. She simply opened her mouth and spoke the 2 words that rendered his entire life, his entire empire, meaningless. "I'm pregnant." The storm outside vanished. The city fell silent. The only sound was the frantic, unfamiliar drumming of his own heart. He felt a sudden, vertiginous drop, as if the floor of his 47th-story office had just given way. "The baby," she added, her voice cracking on the last word, "is yours." The ice in his veins became a glacial freeze. This was not a problem to be solved. It was a reality he could not bend to his will. Before he could process it, a colder, more primal fear took hold. The fear of being trapped, of being anchored, of being known. That fear spoke for him. "How do I know?" The words were quiet, surgical, and utterly vile. He saw the impact in her eyes, a flicker of light extinguished. "Because there's never been anyone else, Patrick," she whispered, and the simple, devastating truth of it disarmed him more than any lie could have. I loved you. Loved. The confession was a spark in a room full of gasoline. Love was a liability he had amputated from his life long ago. Fear in its place took the wheel. It drove him to his desk, to the checkbook in his drawer. It was the only language he trusted, the only power he truly understood. "This is what you want then," he said, the words tasting like ash. He wasn't asking. He was accusing. "A settlement. Name your price." He saw the last vestiges of hope drain from her face, leaving behind a grief so profound it was almost beautiful in its purity. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and he felt his soul being weighed and found wanting. "For 2 years," she said, her voice now impossibly steady, "I saw glimpses of a man worth loving beneath the tyrant everyone else saw. I thought that night. I thought he was the real you." She shook her head, a small, sad gesture of finality. "I was wrong. The tyrant is all there is." She placed the manila envelope on the corner of his desk. It contained a single, folded ultrasound photo. "I don't want your money, Patrick. I want you to know that you had a chance to build something real. And you chose to be king of a kingdom of dust." She turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her. The sound of the wind rushed in, but the silence she left in her wake was louder. Patrick stood alone, the pen still in his hand. He looked at the check, a meaningless string of zeros, and then at the envelope. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just made the worst deal of his life. He had protected his empire by setting fire to his world. Chapter 2. The Kingdom of Dust. 6 months. It was a period in which Patrick Kane had orchestrated a $7 billion merger, launched a new tech subsidiary that was already disrupting the market, and appeared on the cover of Forbes under the headline, "The Untouchable." By every metric he had ever valued, he was more successful than ever. By the only one that now mattered, he was bankrupt. The victories were hollow, the triumphs tasteless. The adrenaline rush of a successful hostile takeover now felt like a cheap drug whose effects faded in minutes, leaving behind a profound, aching silence. It was the silence of his penthouse, a glass cage in the sky that had once felt like a throne and now felt like a tomb. It was the silence where a woman's soft breathing should have been. It was the silence that a child's cry would never fill. His only connection to that stolen world came in a discreetly marked file delivered every Friday. The private investigator's reports were his sacrament and his scourge. He consumed the details with a desperate, shameful hunger. He knew Hillary had found a third-floor walk-up in Queens, that she worked remotely as a bookkeeper, often logging in at 3 a.m. He knew she'd bought a second-hand crib, that she attended prenatal yoga on Tuesdays, and that she always stopped to look at the roses in the bodega on the corner. He was a ghost haunting the edges of her life, a king surveying a kingdom he had abdicated. He was learning every detail of the woman he loved, just as she was learning to live without him. In Queens, the radiator in Hillary's apartment hissed a lonely rhythm against the city's hum. 6 months pregnant, she sat by the window that never quite shut, a cool draught ghosting across her cheek. Inside her, the baby moved, a sudden, insistent flutter that sent a jolt of pure, undiluted love through her entire being. She pressed a hand to her belly, a reflexive gesture of protection and awe. "Just you and me, little one," she whispered into the darkness. It was her mantra, the truth she was building her new world upon. But sometimes, in the quietest hours, a different truth would surface. She would remember the weariness in Patrick's eyes that night, a brief, unguarded glimpse of the man drowning under the weight of his own empire. She had fallen in love with that man, the prisoner, not the king, but the king had won. The love she felt now was different. It wasn't a fragile hope for a man who might be. It was a fierce, lioness love, for the child who was. This love was her shield. This love was her home. It had to be enough. "You look like hell." Patrick didn't look up from the amber liquid in his glass. His brother, David, a pediatric surgeon whose hands saved lives while Patrick's merely signed checks, sat beside him at the private bar. "Go away, David." "I came from the hospital," David said, his voice quiet but unrelenting. "Spent the last 12 hours with the parents of a 6-year-old with leukemia. Father works 2 jobs. Mother just finished her own round of chemo. They take turns sleeping on a vinyl chair in her room. Tonight, he brought her a little star projector he found at a garage sale. He plugged it in, and the whole ceiling lit up like the night sky." David paused, letting the image settle in the space between them. The kid smiled for the first time in a week, and the father, I watched him just stare at that smile. He looked like the richest man in the world, Pat. He has nothing, and he has everything. The story wasn't an accusation, it was a mirror that reflected Patrick's own gilded emptiness. The star projector, the vinyl chair, the smile, it was a currency of love he didn't know how to earn. The $500,000 he'd offered Hillary felt obscene, a fool's attempt to buy a star while a father was giving his daughter the entire galaxy for $3. He left without another word, walking the 40 blocks back to his penthouse. The city was a blur of lives being lived, of loves being shared and lost, and he was utterly separate from it all. Inside his silent apartment, he unlocked a drawer in his desk. He took out the single ultrasound photo Hillary had left behind. It was no longer just a black and white image, a piece of evidence. He stared at the grainy shape, the impossible curve of a spine, the nascent form of a human being, his son or his daughter. A feeling he had mistaken for fear, for the terror of being trapped, finally revealed its true name. It was love. A brutal, terrifying, unconditional love for a child he had never met. It cracked through the foundation of his carefully constructed world, a flood overwhelming the fortress. He sank into his chair, the photo held in a trembling hand. He was the untouchable, the king of a kingdom of dust, and he understood with devastating clarity that he would trade all of it, every stock, every building, every last billion, for a single garage sale star and the right to show it to his child. Chapter 3. The First Cry. The pain was a white-hot sun, eclipsing everything. It pulled Hillary under, a merciless tide, and just as she thought she would drown in it, a voice anchored her. "Respira, mi amor." "Breathe, my love." Mrs. Rodriguez, the neighbor who had become her family, held her hand, her grip a lifeline of wrinkled, unshakable strength. For 9 months, Hillary had prepared for this moment. She had read the books, practiced the breathing, and meditated on her own resilience. All of it was ash in the face of this primal fire. This was not a thing to be managed. It was a storm to be survived. Downstairs, in the sterile darkness of the hospital parking garage, Patrick Kane sat in the driver's seat of his Lamborghini, a laptop open on the passenger side. He had used his vast resources not to intrude, but to watch from a pathetic, self-imposed exile. He'd hacked the hospital's registration system, flagging her file for anonymous alerts. He was tracking her vitals on a screen, the rhythmic spike of her contractions, a digital torture. He was a god of data, and it meant nothing. He was watching the metrics of a miracle he had no right to witness. Each spike in the graph on his screen was a fresh wave of self-loathing. She was in there, alone, going through the crucible of creation. He was in a climate-controlled car, a coward watching a war from a secure bunker miles away. The fear was no longer abstract. It was a physical sickness, a cold sweat on his brow as he realized he wasn't afraid of her rejection. He was afraid that he was utterly, cosmically irrelevant to the most important event of his life. "One more, Hillary. He's right there." The doctor's voice cut through the haze. With a final, guttural scream that tore itself from the very root of her soul, Hilary bore down. The world ripped open, a blinding flash of agony, and then release. A profound, echoing silence descended upon the room. It was broken by the most beautiful sound Patrick had ever heard, even through the tinny speaker of his laptop. It was the first, furious cry of his son, a raw, vibrant declaration of his existence. On the third floor, they placed the baby on Hilary's chest. A boy, 60 seconds old and already the center of her universe. His skin was slick, his body impossibly small and perfect against hers. The pain, the fear, the loneliness of the past 9 months, all of it collapsed into this single, miraculous point of contact. "Hello, Matthew," she wept, her voice thick with an emotion for which there was no name. His crying quieted at the sound of her voice, his tiny, unfocused eyes searching for her. He was real. He was hers. He was everything. In the garage, Patrick shut the laptop. The data stream was over. Reality had begun. He got out of the car, a bouquet of white roses, a laughably inadequate apology, in his hand. The elevator ride to the maternity ward felt like a slow ascent from the underworld. The pastel walls and soft lullabies of the floor were an immediate accusation. This was a place of joy, of family. He was an intruder, a specter of regret. "I'm here to see Hilary Knight," he told the nurse, his voice sounding alien to his own ears. "I'm the father." The nurse's eyes narrowed with a practiced, protective suspicion. "She has a strict no-visitors policy." "Please," he said, the word raw and stripped of its usual power. "I know I'm not expected. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to see my son." Something in his brokenness must have registered. She sighed. "Room 314. But if she asks you to leave, you leave. No exceptions." He walked the hall on legs of lead. Through the small window in the door of room 314, he saw them. Hilary, exhausted and radiant, was looking down at the bundle in her arms with a look of pure adoration. And the baby. He had a shock of dark hair, and as Patrick watched, he yawned. A tiny, perfect motion that mirrored an expression Patrick saw in his own reflection every morning. It was like a key turning in his soul. This was not a concept. This was his son. He knocked, a sound so soft it was barely there. Hilary's head snapped up. The adoration in her eyes was instantly replaced by a guarded, weary shield. But she didn't scream. She didn't call for a nurse. After a long, silent moment, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He entered the room as one might enter a holy place, unworthy and trembling. The roses felt like a profane offering. "Hilary," he started, his voice failing. She didn't speak. Instead, she adjusted the blanket, angling their son so he could see him more clearly. He was perfect. Every fear, every ambition, every dollar in Patrick's name turned to dust. "Would you—" Her voice was hoarse. "Would you like to hold him?" It was a lifeline he hadn't earned. He approached the bed, his hands shaking as he reached out. She carefully transferred the warm, impossibly light bundle into his arms. The moment Matthew's weight settled against his chest, Patrick Kane shattered. The baby smelled of milk and newness, the scent of life itself. His tiny fist, with its impossibly delicate fingernails, curled around Patrick's thumb. A lifetime of emotional armor, of fortified walls and calculated detachment, crumbled into ruin. A sob tore from his throat, ugly and uncontrolled, the sound of a man breaking apart and being remade all at once. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words directed at the sleeping child in his arms, then at the woman in the bed. "Hilary, I am so sorry. I was a coward, Patrick." Her voice was gentle but firm. It cut through his unraveling. "You need to give him back to me now." He looked at her, his vision blurred by tears. She wasn't being cruel. She was being a mother. He reluctantly handed Matthew back, the feeling of emptiness in his arms, immediate and absolute. "We need to rest," she said, her eyes on their son. "You can't be here. This room is for him. It needs to be peaceful." She finally looked at him, and her gaze held no malice, only a vast, tired sadness. "Some things can't be fixed with an apology, Patrick. You made your choice, and this is the consequence. You need to go." Chapter 4. The Uncashed Check. For 3 months, Patrick lived a life bifurcated. In one, he was Patrick Kane, CEO, a titan of industry whose decisions shaped skylines and economies. In the other, he was a ghost, a silent observer of a small third-floor walk-up in Queens. This secret life was governed by a single, sacred ritual, the Friday report from his investigator. He'd study the grainy photos of Hillary pushing a stroller through the park, her face tired but serene. He'd read the dry, itemized lists of her expenditures, diapers, formula, a second-hand baby swing, each purchase a testament to a life being built without him. He was watching her raise his son from a distance of miles and universes. It was a slow, meticulous form of self-torture, and he couldn't stop. He was looking for a sign, a crack in her resolve, something that would allow him to believe she was like everyone else. The crack never appeared. Instead, it was his own world that fractured. The call came from James Wellington, his personal attorney, his voice tight with a confusion that bordered on alarm. "Patrick, we have a problem." "Solve it," Patrick said, his eyes on a stock ticker painting his screen green. "I can't. It's the escrow account, the one we set up for Ms. Knight." There was a pause. "The $500,000. It's never been touched. The check was never cashed." The stock ticker blurred into an emerald smear. Patrick felt the air leave his lungs, a sudden, violent vacuum. "That's not possible. The reports show her struggling. Her freelance income barely covers her rent." "I'm aware," James said quietly. "She's paying the hospital bill in $100 monthly installments, but the check is sitting right where we left it, untouched." The words dismantled Patrick's reality. His entire life was built on a single, cynical axiom: everyone has a price. It was the principle upon which he'd built his empire, the lens through which he viewed all of humanity. And Hillary Knight, with her $100 hospital payments and second-hand baby swing, had just proven him a fool. Her refusal wasn't an act of pride, it was a judgment. She had looked at the price he'd put on his own child and found it worthless. The drive to Queens was a descent. He left his gleaming tower of glass and steel and plunged into the borough's vibrant, chaotic heart. The building was even more worn than in the photos, smelling of damp concrete and the mingled aromas of a dozen different dinners. He took the stairs, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs with each flight. He stood before apartment 3B, his hand raised to knock, when he heard a sound from within. Matthew, cooing and then fussing. Then Hillary's voice, soft and impossibly weary. "I know, little man, I know. Mama's tired too, but we've got one more ledger to finish and then we can sleep." The quiet intimacy of it was a knife to his chest. This was their life, a universe for two, and he was a foreigner at the gate. He knocked. Silence. Then, the sound of a lock turning. The door opened a few inches, and Hillary stood there looking pale and thinner than he remembered, but her eyes held a fire he'd never seen before. It was the protective fire of a mother. "What are you doing here, Patrick?" I had to see you," he stammered, feeling like a boy before his principal. He saw the apartment behind her, small, clean, but crowded with the paraphernalia of a new baby. It was a home, not a holding cell. "Why?" He couldn't lie. Not anymore. "The check," he said, the words tasting like poison. "You never cashed it." Her expression, which had been wary, hardened into something cold and sharp. "And that surprised you? Did you think my principles were for sale?" I didn't know what to think," he confessed, the admission costing him everything. He pulled a file from his coat, not the check, but the investigator's report. "So I had you watched." The fire in her eyes turned to ice. "You what?" she whispered, the words trembling with a quiet, lethal fury. "You violated my privacy. You spied on me and my son because you couldn't accept that I didn't want your blood money. I did it because I was wrong." The words burst out of him, raw and desperate. "I was so wrong about you, about everything. My world doesn't have people like you in it, Hillary. People who choose dignity over wealth. I couldn't understand it, and it was killing me." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a plea. "I read about your life, every bill, every struggle. I saw what you were sacrificing, not for pride, for him." He gestured helplessly toward the sound of the baby inside. "I didn't come here to offer you money again. I came here to confess. I am a fool. I am a coward. And my son is being raised by the strongest person I have ever known, and I am not a part of his life." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling with the force of her anger and her pain. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of a baby's gentle breathing from the other room. "What do you want, Patrick?" she finally asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He looked into her eyes and gave her the only truth he had left. "I want nothing. I deserve nothing. But Matthew deserves a father. I know I'm not him. But I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to become a man who is—" She searched his face, looking for the predator, the deal-maker, the tyrant. He let her see all of it, and all of the brokenness that lay beneath. "One chance," she said, her voice barely audible. The words were not an absolution. They were a sentence. "Not for you, for him. You will see him on my terms. You will follow my rules. And the moment you fail, the moment you put yourself before him, you are gone, forever. Do you understand?" He nodded, unable to speak, a wave of desperate, terrifying hope washing over him. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love. It was a door, cracked open just enough for a sliver of light to get through. And for now, it was everything. Chapter 5. The Language of Swings. Redemption was not a lightning strike. It was the slow, grinding erosion of a mountain. For 8 months, Patrick's life was measured in Saturday mornings. He would leave his silent penthouse before dawn, drive the 45 minutes to Queens, and present himself at the door of apartment 3B, not as a billionaire or a CEO, but as Matthew's father. His first lesson was in humility. He, a man who commanded boardrooms, could not figure out the arcane engineering of a collapsible stroller. He, who negotiated 9-figure deals, could not coax a spoonful of mashed pears into his son's mouth. He learned to change a diaper, to check for a fever, to distinguish a cry of hunger from one of pain. These were skills his money could not buy, and his power could not command. They could only be learned through patient, repetitive, and often messy practice. Hillary was a constant, watchful presence. She never offered praise, only quiet correction. Her apartment was neutral territory, a space where he was a guest with probationary privileges. He saw the exhaustion that lived deep in her bones, but he also saw the fierce, unwavering love she had for their son. He was careful not to overstep, not to presume. He brought no expensive gifts, only his time and his fumbling, desperate effort. He was learning a new language, not of contracts and clauses, but of playground swings and peekaboo. Today, on the cusp of Matthew's first birthday, something felt different. The air was charged. "Patrick," Hillary said as he was packing Matthew's diaper bag for their weekly trip to the park. "When you get back, we need to talk." The words were a death knell. A cold dread washed over him. 8 months of progress, of building a fragile bridge of trust, felt as if it were about to be swept away. He nodded, unable to speak, and took his son's hand. At the park, the world felt both intensely vivid and dreamlike. He pushed Matthew on the swing, the simple back-and-forth motion, a pendulum marking the seconds of his borrowed time. At 11 months, Matthew was a whirlwind of joyous energy, a perfect fusion of Hilary's gentle curiosity and Patrick's own stubborn intensity. "Dada, up!" Matthew squealed, his small face alight with a trust so pure it was painful to behold. Patrick's love for his son was a physical ache in his chest, a constant low-grade fever. It was a love that demanded nothing in return except the right to exist. He watched Matthew chase a pigeon with fearless determination and knew, with absolute certainty, that he would spend the rest of his life on his knees if it meant he could keep watching this small boy grow. When they returned, Matthew was asleep in his arms. He gently laid him in his crib, the motion now familiar and practiced. He found Hilary at the small kitchen table, a letter in her hands. "I was offered a job," she said, her voice flat. "A senior position at an accounting firm, in Denver." Denver, 1,000 miles away. The word was a sentence. "It's a great offer," she continued, her eyes on the letter, not on him. "Full benefits, a corner office, a salary that would let me buy a small house with a yard. Everything I should want. Everything that makes sense." Patrick's throat was tight. He had no right to ask her to stay. No right to ask her to choose this hard, broken path over a clean, sensible future. "You should take it," he said, the words tasting like glass. "It's a wonderful opportunity. You and Matthew will be happy there." She finally looked up, and her eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Why aren't you fighting for me to stay?" "Because that would be for me, not for you," he said, his voice raw with a truth he had only recently learned. "My only right is to want what is best for you and for our son. If that's Denver, then it's Denver." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. The old Patrick would have tried to buy the company and shut it down. He would have seen it as a negotiation to be won. "The old Patrick was a fool," he whispered. "He didn't know what winning was." She stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the fire escape. "For 8 months, I have watched you. I watched you show up in a $1,000 suit and get apple juice spilled all over it, and you didn't even flinch. I watched you learn the names of all the other kids at the playground. I watched you hold Matthew when he was sick, walking him around this tiny apartment for hours because it was the only thing that would soothe him." She turned back to face him, her expression a fragile mix of fear and hope. "I see him, you know. The man I thought I saw that night. The man I fell in love with. He's not a ghost. He's real." Patrick held his breath. "I'm terrified of him," she confessed. "I'm terrified of trusting him. The offer in Denver is safe, but I've started to wonder if the best things in life aren't supposed to be safe." She took a shaky breath, making a decision that would alter the course of their lives. "I'm not taking the job." Relief, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees, surged through him. But he knew this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, with new terms. "Hilary," he said, taking a tentative step toward her, "I love you. I never stopped. But I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to say that to you. We can do this however you want, one day at a time." She met him in the middle of the small room, the space between them finally closing. "We do this together, Patrick," she said, her voice gaining strength. "As a family, a real one. No more secrets, no more fear. We build something new, from the ground up." He reached out and gently brushed the tear from her cheek, his touch hesitant, reverent. It wasn't a victory, it was a covenant, a promise to build a future on the ruins of the past, together. Chapter 6. The Man in the Mirror. 3 years later, the ghost of the man Patrick Kane used to be was mostly just that, a ghost. He lived in a house in Westchester where the floors were perpetually strewn with Lego bricks and the silence was a distant memory. He was now a husband, a father to a brilliant, boisterous 4-year-old, and his wife, Hilary, was 7 months pregnant with their daughter. Their life was a chaotic, beautiful, and deeply ordinary miracle they had built together, one day at a time. The transformation was real. Kane Industries had become a leader in ethical business practices, and its profits had never been higher. He'd learned that loyalty, when earned rather than demanded, was the greatest asset on any balance sheet. But ghosts have a way of finding you. The attack came without warning. Marcus Thorne, a corporate raider with a reputation for savagery that rivaled Patrick's old one, launched a hostile takeover bid for Kane Industries. Thorne's strategy was brutally personal. He didn't just attack the company's financials, he attacked Patrick's character. He painted a picture for the shareholders of a once great corporate predator gone soft, a man distracted by domesticity who had traded his killer instinct for school pickups and playground duty. He was using Patrick's redemption as the very weapon to destroy him. The old instincts flared inside Patrick like a pilot light hitting a gas leak. The late-night strategy sessions began, the war room reassembled. His lawyers advised him to go for the jugular, to dig into Thorne's personal life, to leak damaging information, to bankrupt him, to ruin him, to become the monster. Hilary watched the change with a quiet, growing dread. She saw the old tension in his jaw, the cold, calculating light returning to his eyes. He was sleeping less, his mind constantly turning, sharpening itself back into a weapon. One night, she found him in his home office at 3 a.m., staring at a screen filled with opposition research on Thorne, a litany of personal failings and ugly secrets. "This is how you'll beat him?" she asked, her voice soft but clear in the silent house. "This is how the game is played," he said, not looking at her. "Thorne came after my family. He called me weak because of you and Matthew. I'm going to make him regret he was ever born." "And who will you be when you're done?" she asked, stepping into the room. She placed a hand on his shoulder, not to stop him, but to make him feel her presence. "For 3 years, I've been married to the man I always knew you could be. A man who is strong enough to be gentle, powerful enough to be kind. I fell in love with that man. Matthew worships that man." She looked at the screen, at the ugly ammunition he was preparing to fire. "The man who uses this to win. I know him too. I remember him, and I will not have him raising my children." It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a statement of fact, a reminder of the stakes. The battle wasn't for his company, it was for his soul. The day of the emergency shareholder meeting arrived, the atmosphere in the grand hall electric with tension. Thorne spoke first, delivering a masterful performance that painted Patrick as a relic, a king who had lost his nerve. Then it was Patrick's turn. He walked to the podium, his face an unreadable mask. His lawyers expected a bloodbath. The board expected the return of the tyrant. He looked out at the sea of faces, finding Hilary's in the back row. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of encouragement. It was a nod of trust. "Mr. Thorne is right," Patrick began, a murmur of shock rippling through the room. "The man who founded this company 15 years ago is gone. That man was a predator. He believed that value was something you took, not something you built. He measured strength by the fear he inspired. And he was, without a doubt, the poorest man I've ever known." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "For the past 3 years, we have operated on a different principle, that the true value of a company is not in its stock price, but in the loyalty of its employees and the trust of its customers. That real strength isn't about destroying your competition, but about building something so innovative and essential that your competition is forced to become better. Mr. Thorne offers you a return to the past, a victory of scorched earth. I am offering you a future. A legacy." He didn't mention Thorne again. He laid out his vision for the next decade, a future built on sustainable growth and integrity. He was betting his entire empire not on his old ruthlessness, but on his newfound wisdom. When the vote was tallied, he had won. It wasn't a landslide, but it was decisive. He had faced the ghost of his past and defeated him, not by becoming him, but by proving he was stronger without him. That evening, in the quiet of their backyard, Patrick watched as Matthew chased fireflies. Hilary came and stood beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I was so proud of you today," she whispered. He turned to her, his eyes clear and calm for the first time in weeks. He took a small velvet box from his pocket. "We are already married," she said with a soft, tearful laugh. "The first time I asked, it was a desperate attempt to fix what I'd broken," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple, beautiful eternity band. "This time, this is different. This is a promise. To the woman who taught me the difference between a kingdom and a home. To the partner who walked through the fire with me and reminded me who I was fighting to be." He knelt, not as a king or a CEO, but simply as a man, completely and irrevocably in love. "Hilary Kane, will you keep choosing me every day for the rest of our lives?" "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as he slid the ring onto her finger next to the one he'd given her 3 years ago. "Always yes." A small body collided with their legs. "Mama is crying happy tears," Matthew announced, holding up a jar with a single blinking firefly inside. Patrick scooped his son into his arms, wrapping his other arm around his wife and their unborn daughter. He looked at the vast, star-filled sky, and then at the tiny, captured star in his son's jar, and finally at the incredible, messy, perfect family in his arms. He had finally learned that true wealth wasn't about what you owned. It was about what you would refuse to sell at any price. And in that moment, surrounded by his entire world, Patrick Kane was the richest man alive.